With only 2 suitcases and a few $1,000s to her name, 70-year-old Margaret stood on the sidewalk watching the only home she had owned for 40 years disappear behind a locked door. Her own daughter had just tricked her into signing away the deed, coldly giving her exactly 30 days to pack up her entire life and get out. But what her greedy family didn't know, what nobody in that mocking city could have predicted, was that the collapsed stone ruin Margaret would buy weeks later for just $500 at a county auction would reveal a 150-year-old secret that would change everything, not just for her, but for the entire scientific world. The auction house erupted in laughter when Margaret raised her paddle to buy a property the county had condemned as a worthless pile of rocks. They said she was a confused old woman buying her own grave. They were wrong about everything. This is the story of how a woman discarded by her own blood became the guardian of a priceless historical treasure, and how dignity, once stolen, can be reclaimed with your own two bare hands. But before we begin Margaret's incredible journey, I want to invite you to be part of our community. If you love stories about resilience, second chances, and the courage to rebuild when everything seems lost, please subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. We share inspiring stories every week about people who refuse to give up, and your support helps us bring these powerful messages to more people who need to hear them. Now, let's go back to the very beginning to see how the anatomy of a betrayal truly unfolds. A single signature on a crisp piece of paper holds the power to erase 40 years of stability. It transforms a homeowner into a trespasser in a matter of seconds. This is the anatomy of a betrayal. It does not begin with a sworn enemy or a sudden disaster. It starts with a trusted smile across a kitchen table. Margaret spent 4 decades building her fortress. Her house was a living archive of her existence. She knew the exact sound of the third stair creaking. She remembered planting the oak tree in the front yard when it was just a fragile sapling. The walls held the echoes of family dinners, holiday celebrations, and quiet winter evenings. The mortgage was paid off long ago. The property represented absolute security. It was an extension of her physical body. Then came the proposition. Her daughter, Sarah, arrived with a folder of documents. The conversation was framed around care and foresight. Sarah spoke of estate taxes, legal loopholes, and the burden of property management. She offered to take the administrative weight off her mother's shoulders. The proposal was simple: transfer the deed to a trust managed by the daughter. It was presented as a mere formality, a shield against future bureaucratic headaches. Mothers do not audit their children. The biological imperative to trust one's offspring overrides basic self-preservation. Margaret did not hire an independent lawyer. She did not read the dense paragraphs of legal jargon. She looked at her daughter's reassuring face and picked up the pen. The scratch of the ink on the paper lasted 3 seconds. In that brief window, Margaret signed away her sanctuary. She legally became a guest in her own life. The metamorphosis of the space was not immediate. It happened through microaggressions. A week after the paperwork was filed, Sarah's husband began measuring the living room. They discussed open concept layouts and modern fixtures. Margaret's antique furniture was suddenly described as clutter. Her daily routines became inconveniences. The atmosphere grew dense with unspoken tension. The house itself seemed to reject its original creator. The power dynamic inverted completely. Margaret found herself asking permission to invite friends over. She hesitated before adjusting the thermostat. The psychological shrinking of her territory was suffocating. She was living inside a trap of her own making. The affection that prompted the signature vanished. It was replaced by cold, pragmatic ownership. The final blow arrived on a Tuesday morning. Sarah sat at the same kitchen table. The mask of the caring daughter was gone. She explained that the property value had peaked. They needed capital for a new business venture. The house was going on the market. Margaret had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic confrontation. The cruelty was delivered in a calm, measured tone. Sarah offered a small, inadequate sum of money to help with the transition. She rationalized the decision with brutal efficiency. Margaret was getting older. She needed a smaller place. The narrative was twisted to make the eviction sound like an act of mercy. The betrayal shattered Margaret's cognitive map. The foundation of her reality collapsed. If a child could coldly dismantle her mother's life, the universe possessed no rules. The pain was a physical weight in her chest. It paralyzed her. She spent the next 3 weeks in a state of profound dissociation. Packing was an exercise in self-erasure. 40 years of accumulation cannot fit into a new, uncertain reality. Margaret had to filter her entire life through the lens of strict necessity. The fine china was left behind. The heavy photo albums were abandoned in the attic. She packed 2 large suitcases. They contained practical clothing, essential documents, and a few small keepsakes. Everything else was classified as debris. The day of departure was silent. Margaret stood on the porch. She watched the new owner's contractors arrive. She pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place. That sharp, metallic sound severed her from her past. She walked down the driveway. She did not look back at the oak tree. The freefall into social isolation began immediately. Margaret rented a cheap room in a transient motel on the edge of the city. The loss of her physical address triggered a cascade of secondary losses. Her social circle dissolved. Former neighbors felt awkward. They avoided her calls. They feared the contagion of her misfortune. Society views an elderly woman without a permanent home as a systemic failure. People look away to protect their own illusions of safety. Her phone stopped ringing. The legal system offered no recourse. The documents were signed willingly. The law does not recognize emotional manipulation as a crime. Margaret was officially deleted from the social registry. She was no longer a homeowner, a neighbor, or a matriarch. She became a ghost. This absolute 0 point stripped away all previous identities. The family bond was revealed as a predatory transaction. The illusion of safety was permanently shattered. Margaret sat on the edge of a narrow motel bed. She looked at her 2 suitcases. She had no destination. She had no safety net. The world had turned its back on her. Yet, in this terrifying vacuum, a strange clarity began to form. The worst had already happened. The fear of losing everything was gone. She had nothing left to protect. This total devastation laid the brutal, necessary groundwork for a radical reinvention. The air conditioning in the municipal hall hums with a sterile, mechanical drone. Rows of padded chairs hold men and women in tailored suits. They smell of expensive espresso and calculated risk. This is the county tax foreclosure auction, a graveyard of defaulted properties. In the back row sits Margaret. She is 70 years old. Her gray coat is frayed at the cuffs. She grips a manila envelope containing her entire net worth, $3,200. 2 weeks ago, she had a home. She had a family. Then came the legal papers, a quiet transfer of deeds, a daughter's signature, a gentle suggestion about an assisted living facility. Margaret packed a single suitcase. She walked out before they could carry her out. She chose voluntary exile over comfortable captivity. The auctioneer stands on a raised podium. He speaks in a rapid, practiced staccato. Properties flash on the digital projector. Suburban homes, commercial lots. The investors raise their paddles. Hundreds of thousands of dollars change hands in seconds. Margaret watches the screen. She waits. Lot number 42 appears. The rhythm of the room breaks. The auctioneer pauses, adjusting his glasses. The image on the screen shows a pile of moss-covered stones. It is a collapsed 19th century storage vault. The roof is gone. Birch trees grow through the shattered foundation. It sits on a quarter-acre of steep, unusable hillside. The county classified it as a liability. The demolition costs exceed the land value. It is a negative asset. Starting bid is $500, the auctioneer announces. His voice lacks enthusiasm. He expects to pass the lot. The investors chuckle. A man in the front row leans over to his colleague. He makes a joke about buying a personal rock quarry. The laughter ripples through the hall. It is casual, dismissive laughter, the mockery of the successful directed at the absurd. Margaret feels the vibration of that laughter in her chest. It is the same tone her son-in-law used when discussing her memory lapses. The sound of being written off. She raises her paddle. Number 87. The movement is slow. Her arthritic shoulder protests. The white plastic paddle cuts through the conditioned air. The auctioneer stops. He squints toward the back of the room. The murmurs die instantly. Heads turn. Dozens of eyes lock onto the elderly woman in the frayed coat. The silence is heavy, thick with sudden, uninvited scrutiny. They see a confused old woman making a mistake. They see a victim of dementia. The man in the front row openly sneers. The humiliation hangs in the air, a physical weight pressing down on Margaret's shoulders. She does not lower the paddle. She stares directly at the auctioneer. Her chin lifts a fraction of an inch. This is not a real estate transaction. It is a psychological pact. Margaret recognizes the stones on the screen. Society deemed that structure broken beyond repair. Society deemed Margaret obsolete. They are both remnants, discarded husks taking up space. By purchasing the ruin, she takes ownership of her own rejection. She buys the very concept of worthlessness. If she can claim this shattered shell, she can claim herself. The mockery of the crowd acts as a catalyst. Their disdain burns away the last of her fear. The public humiliation transforms into a strange, cold armor. 500 to the bidder in the back, the auctioneer says. He sounds uncertain. Do I hear 600? Silence. No one will touch this lot. No one will compete for garbage. Going once, going twice. The wooden gavel strikes the sounding block, a sharp, final crack. Sold. Margaret lowers her arm. The transaction is complete. She stands up. Her knees pop softly in the quiet room. She walks down the center aisle. The investors part slightly, pulling their briefcases out of her way. They avoid eye contact. She is no longer just an old woman. She is an anomaly, an unpredictable element in their ordered world. She reaches the clerk's desk beside the podium. The clerk slides a stack of forms across the laminate surface. Margaret opens her manila envelope. She pulls out worn bills. 50s, 20s, 10s. She counts them out meticulously. The paper money smells like old cedar drawers and time. The clerk processes the payment. He stamps the receipt. He hands her a single sheet of paper. The deed. Margaret takes the document. The paper is crisp. It feels heavy in her thin hands. She just spent a fraction of her meager survival fund on a pile of rocks. She has no roof. She has no running water. She has no electricity. She has purchased absolute destitution. But as she walks out of the municipal building into the glaring afternoon sun, her posture changes. Her spine straightens. The crushing weight of her family's betrayal recedes, replaced by a different kind of gravity. She is entirely alone. She is completely isolated. The safety net is gone. Yet, for the first time in a decade, she is the sole proprietor of her reality. The ruin is hers. The dirt is hers. The failure, if it comes, will be hers alone. The bottom of the abyss is hard, cold, and unforgiving. But it is solid. You can build on solid ground. Margaret folds the deed into her pocket. She turns her back on the city. She begins the long journey toward the valley. The walk to the bus terminal takes 45 minutes. Every step distances her from the life she knew. The city sidewalks feel foreign. The rushing pedestrians are ghosts. They hurry toward warm homes and waiting families. Margaret moves in a parallel dimension. She is a newly minted outcast. She boards the regional transit bus. The destination is the end of the line, a forgotten rural sector 30 miles outside the metropolitan boundary. She presses her forehead against the vibrating window glass. The urban sprawl gives way to cracked highways. Strip malls dissolve into overgrown fields. Industrial parks fade into dense, unmanaged forests. She analyzes her decision. There is no panic. Panic requires the hope of rescue. Margaret has eradicated hope. Hope is a vulnerability. It was hope that made her trust her daughter's financial advisor. It was hope that kept her signing documents she could not read without her glasses. Now, only cold mechanics remain. Survival is a mathematical equation. She has $2,700 left. She has a suitcase containing winter clothes, a sturdy pair of boots, and basic hygiene supplies. She has a piece of paper granting her legal dominion over a hazard zone. The bus stops at a rural crossroads. The doors hiss open. Margaret steps down onto the gravel shoulder. The bus pulls away, leaving a cloud of diesel exhaust. The silence of the valley hits her instantly. It is absolute. No sirens, no neighbors arguing, no television sets murmuring through thin apartment walls. She faces a dirt road, winding up a steep incline. The property line begins 2 miles up this trail. She begins to climb. The suitcase wheels catch on rocks and ruts. She abandons the wheels. She lifts the case by the handle. The physical exertion forces her heart to pound against her ribs. Her breath comes in ragged gasps. This pain is necessary. It is a physical purge. The exertion burns away the lingering shame of the auction room. The investor's laughter echoes in her memory. She dissects that sound. They laughed because they calculate value based on extraction. What can be taken from the land? What can be monetized? Margaret's calculus is fundamentally different. She seeks a place that demands nothing because it has nothing left to give. The ruined vault cannot be exploited. It can only be inhabited. It requires a steward, not an investor. The sun begins to dip behind the tree line. Shadows stretch across the dirt road. The temperature drops sharply. She reaches the crest of the hill. The road ends in a tangle of blackberry brambles. Beyond the thorns lies Lot 42. Margaret pushes through the brush. The thorns tear at her frayed coat. They scratch her hands. She ignores the stinging. She steps into the clearing. The reality of her purchase stands before her. The auction screen photograph did not capture the scale of the devastation. The stone walls are 3 feet thick, but the entire southern facade has collapsed. Massive blocks of granite lie scattered like discarded toys. The wooden roof beams are rotted, pointing toward the darkening sky like broken ribs. Ferns grow from the mortar joints. A thick carpet of wet, decaying leaves covers the interior floor. The smell of damp earth and ancient stone is overpowering. It is a corpse of a building. Margaret drops her suitcase. She walks to the nearest standing wall. She places her bare hand against the cold granite. The stone is rough. It is covered in pale green lichen. She presses her weight against it. The wall does not move. It does not yield. A profound sense of relief washes over her. Human relationships are fragile. Promises dissolve. Blood ties snap under the pressure of greed. This granite is indifferent. It does not lie. It does not pretend to care. It simply exists. She steps over a fallen lintel and enters the interior of the ruin. The walls block the evening wind. The temperature inside the stone shell is marginally warmer. She looks up. There is no ceiling. The first stars appear in the twilight sky. Tonight, She will sleep on a bed of wet leaves. She will wrap herself in every piece of clothing she owns. She will shiver. She will ache. But she will not be evicted. No one will slide a brochure for a nursing home under a door that does not exist. Margaret opens her suitcase. She pulls out a heavy wool blanket. She finds a relatively flat corner, shielded by a massive fallen slab. She begins to clear the wet leaves with her bare hands. Her fingernails pack with dark soil. This is the first labor of her new existence. It is not a chore. It is a ritual of claiming space. Every handful of dirt she moves asserts her authority. The humiliation of the auction hall is dead. The betrayal of her family is locked away in the city. Here, in the cold, creeping dark, Margaret is the absolute sovereign of the ruins. The deal with despair has been struck. The transaction is final. The rebuilding begins tomorrow. The autumn wind did not knock. It simply tore through the rotting window frames. The temperature dropped by 10 degrees in a single afternoon. Frost covered the dead grass. Winter was advancing rapidly. The woman stood in the center of the ruined structure. She had no professional tools. She had no building materials. She possessed only a rusty hammer, a dull handsaw, and a jar of bent nails left behind by the previous owners. The survival clock had started ticking. The house was essentially a wooden skeleton. The roof sagged under the weight of decades of neglect. Daylight bled through the gaps between the logs. Society had discarded this building. Society had discarded her. Now, they were left alone to face the approaching blizzards. Panic was a luxury she could no longer afford. Despair required energy. She redirected every ounce of her remaining strength into pure, mechanical action. The first task was closing the perimeter. The wind was the immediate enemy. It stole the meager heat generated by her body. She walked into the surrounding forest. She did not look for beauty. She looked for utility. Fallen pine branches became her raw material. She dragged heavy timber back to the clearing. Her hands, soft from a lifetime of urban comfort, blistered within the first 2 hours. The skin tore. Blood mixed with dirt. She did not stop. She wrapped her palms in torn strips of an old shirt and continued working. The broken windows needed sealing. Glass was out of the question. She found discarded sheets of thick, industrial plastic in a nearby illegal dumping ground. She dragged them back. She cut the plastic with a dull kitchen knife. She nailed the sheets over the empty frames. She hammered the bent nails straight, using a flat stone. Every strike of the hammer sent a shockwave up her aching arm. The plastic held. The wind hit the barrier and snapped the material like a ship's sail. The draft inside the room died down. It was a minor victory. It was the first time in months she felt a sense of control. Next came the walls. The wooden logs had shrunk over the years. The gaps were wide enough to slide a hand through. Modern insulation was an impossible dream. She had to rely on ancient methods. She observed the local wildlife. Birds used mud and dry matter to build nests. She decided to mimic them. She dug a pit in the yard. She extracted heavy red clay from the frozen earth. She carried water from the nearby stream in a cracked plastic bucket. She mixed the clay with water, dry autumn leaves, and dead grass. She used her bare hands and feet to knead the cold, heavy mass. The freezing mud numbed her extremities. She carried the heavy mixture inside in small batches. She pushed the clay deep into the cracks between the logs. She smoothed it over with her fingers. The process was agonizingly slow. There were hundreds of gaps. She worked from dawn until the last light faded. Her back screamed in pain. Her knees swelled. This brutal physical labor triggered a profound mental shift. The trauma of her recent betrayal began to recede. The agonizing memories of her family's rejection lost their sharp edges. The brain cannot process complex emotional grief when the body is fighting for basic survival. The hierarchy of needs took over. Hunger replaced sorrow. Cold replaced anger. The necessity of shelter erased the sting of abandonment. Her body began to adapt. The blisters turned into thick, yellow calluses. Her muscles, previously dormant, grew dense and hard. The constant shivering burned calories, forcing her to eat whatever she could forage or buy with her meager remaining coins. She boiled cheap oats on a small camping stove. The bland porridge tasted better than any gourmet meal she had ever eaten. Hunger was a spectacular chef. The roof was the most dangerous challenge. Several wooden shingles were missing. Rainwater had already rotted the floorboards beneath the holes. Snow would easily crush the weakened structure. She had to climb up. She built a makeshift ladder from thick branches and rusted wire. It wobbled with every step. She climbed onto the sloping, slippery roof. The wind threatened to push her off. A fall from this height would mean broken bones. Broken bones meant certain death in this isolation. She crawled on her stomach. She distributed her weight evenly to avoid breaking through the rotten wood. She carried pieces of scavenged tin roofing. She positioned the tin over the gaping holes. She drove the nails in with short, precise strikes. Fear sharpened her focus. There was no room for error. She secured the patches with heavy stones gathered from the riverbank. Days bled into weeks. The house slowly transformed. It was ugly. It was scarred. It was covered in plastic, dried mud, and mismatched tin. But it was becoming a fortress. The dialogue between the woman and the elements was reaching a stalemate. The forest threw freezing rain at the house. The house deflected it. The final test was the heating system. The old brick stove in the corner of the room was a mystery. The chimney was clogged with years of debris and bird nests. Lighting a fire without clearing it would fill the room with deadly carbon monoxide. She fashioned a chimney sweep from a long, flexible pine sapling and a bundle of stiff twigs. She climbed back onto the roof. She shoved the makeshift brush down the dark brick pipe. She pushed and twisted. Years of accumulated soot and dirt cascaded down into the hearth. She emerged covered in black dust. She looked like a coal miner. She felt like a conqueror. She gathered dry kindling. She stacked the wood carefully inside the cold iron belly of the stove. She struck a match. The small flame licked the dry bark. The fire caught. Smoke hesitated, then drew upward into the cleared chimney. The draft was perfect. The wood cracked. The fire roared. The heavy cast iron began to radiate heat. The woman sat on the dusty floor. She watched the flames dance behind the metal grate. The temperature in the small room slowly began to rise. The damp chill retreated into the corners. The clay insulation held the warmth inside. That night, the first real blizzard struck. The wind howled with terrifying force. Trees snapped in the forest. Millions of snowflakes battered the plastic windows. The storm raged outside, desperate to claim the ruined building. Inside, it was quiet. The stove hummed. The air was dry and warm. The woman lay on her makeshift bed of piled blankets. Her body ached with a deep, satisfying exhaustion. She listened to the furious storm. She did not feel fear. She felt an overwhelming sense of absolute security. She had built this safety with her own 2 hands. She had negotiated with the unforgiving environment and won. The fragile pensioner who had been exiled by her own blood was gone. The harsh conditions had burned away her dependency. The physical suffering had forged a new, resilient architecture of the mind. She was no longer a victim waiting for the end. She was the absolute master of her small, warm universe. The winter could scream all it wanted. She was ready. The tape measure did not lie. There was a discrepancy of exactly 3 feet between the exterior roofline and the interior ceiling. She tapped the blackened pine planks above her head. The sound was dull, heavy. It lacked the hollow echo of an empty attic. This decaying forest house held a structural secret. The architecture itself was a deliberate deception. Someone had lowered the ceiling. They built a hidden room within a sealed void. This architectural manipulation happened over 150 years ago. She needed dry timber to reinforce the failing walls. The rotting ceiling beams seemed like an easy source of salvageable wood. She took a rusted iron crowbar. She wedged it between two massive larchboards. The metal groaned under her weight. The ancient wood splintered with a sharp crack. A cascade of gray dust poured from the fracture. It blinded her for a moment. The dust tasted of dry earth and pulverized bone. The gap widened. She shined a heavy tactical flashlight into the dark breach. The harsh beam cut through swirling motes of debris. It illuminated a massive iron-bound trunk. Next to it sat 3 wooden crates. Thick leather straps held them shut. Dense silver cobwebs draped over tarnished brass instruments. The hidden space was perfectly dry. The builder had packed the cavity with dried sphagnum moss and horsehair. The double ceiling acted as a hermetic seal. It was a flawless, climate-controlled vault. She pulled the first crate toward the jagged opening. It weighed over 40 pounds. The wood was freezing to the touch. She lowered it carefully to the dirt floor. The iron latch snapped off in her hands. Rust had entirely eaten through the internal pin. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay hundreds of bound notebooks. The covers were crafted from cured calfskin. The pages were thick cotton rag paper. No moisture or mold had touched them in a century and a half. She opened the top volume. The ink was a deep iron gall brown. The handwriting was sharp, precise, relentless. It belonged to a highly disciplined mind. These were not personal diaries. They were exhaustive data logs. Columns of numbers filled the margins. Detailed anatomical sketches of root systems covered the center spreads. Dried botanical specimens lay pressed between sheets of translucent wax paper. Some preserved alpine flowers still retained their faded purple pigments. She found a heavy brass barometer in the second trunk. Beside it lay a complex theodolite. A cylindrical leather map case held tightly rolled parchment. She unrolled the largest sheet across the floor. It was a hand-drawn topographical survey of the surrounding valley. The date in the bottom corner read 1872. The map showed vast river networks that had long since dried up. It marked precise elevation points that matched the current terrain perfectly. Her hand stopped shaking from the cold. A new kind of absolute focus took over. This was a complete, unbroken meteorological and botanical record. It documented a regional microclimate that no longer existed. Modern science had permanently lost this data. The official regional archives had burned to the ground during the Great Fire of 1912. She was looking at the only surviving copy of the valley's ecological history. She looked around her damp, freezing room. Her own immediate survival suddenly felt entirely secondary. The house was no longer just a desperate shelter. It was a reliquary. The person who hid these trunks understood the extreme fragility of knowledge. They sacrificed the vital warmth of a high ceiling to protect their life's work from theft or destruction. Absolute isolation breeds a specific kind of mental decay. It forces the human mind to consume its own trauma. These ancient notebooks offered an immediate escape hatch. She began to read the entries aloud. Her voice broke the oppressive silence of the dead forest. The words belonged to a forgotten, exiled naturalist. He recorded daily barometric pressure with obsessive accuracy. He noted the exact blooming times of rare orchids. He tracked the complex migration patterns of bird species that were now globally extinct. The next morning, her daily routine fractured and rebuilt itself. Chopping wood and boiling snow took half the usual time. The rest of the brief daylight belonged entirely to the archive. She cleared the large oak table. She wiped the rough surface down with a dry cloth. She laid out the leather notebooks in strict chronological order. There were exactly 47 volumes. She needed a rigorous system. She found a tin box of graphite pencils in the third crate. She started transcribing the fragile pages. The cotton paper was brittle at the edges. She turned each leaf with surgical care. She categorized the raw data. Climate patterns went into one ledger, botanical sketches into another. Geological anomalies formed a third distinct pile. The forgotten naturalist had discovered something vital. The soil composition in the eastern ridge contained highly rare mineral deposits. His daily notes detailed a complex symbiotic relationship between a specific subterranean fungus and the root systems of the ancient pine trees. This precise interaction explained the abnormal growth rates in the old forest. Modern forestry experts had debated this exact phenomenon for 4 decades. The definitive answer had been sitting quietly above her head. The stakes of her existence shifted dramatically. The roof was still failing. Massive winter storms were approaching from the north. Heavy snow would inevitably crush the weakened rafters. Melting ice water would destroy the unprotected paper. She had to secure the perimeter immediately. Her physical labor gained a frantic, relentless edge. She was no longer patching leaks just to keep her own sleeping bag dry. She was actively defending an irreplaceable scientific legacy. She climbed onto the steep roof. The freezing wind bit through her thin coat. She nailed heavy waterproof tarps over the exposed, rotting shingles. She reinforced the interior load-bearing beams with massive fallen oak trunks. She worked until her shoulder muscles cramped and seized. The physical pain was entirely irrelevant. The new mission provided an unlimited psychological fuel source. Despair requires a vacuum to thrive. Deep purpose eradicates that vacuum instantly. The severe trauma of her recent past began to dissolve. The brutal social rejection that drove her into the woods lost its paralyzing sting. Society had exiled her. It had stripped her of all status. Yet, she now held the absolute key to its ecological memory. The irony was sharp and empowering. Night fell over the valley. She lit a single kerosene lamp. The warm yellow light washed over the ancient, cracked maps. She traced the faded ink lines with her bare finger. She felt a profound dialogue opening up in the empty room. It was a silent conversation across a century and a half. 2 isolated, marginalized souls were connecting through the medium of raw, undeniable data. The naturalist had left a desperate message in a bottle. She was the one who finally pulled it from the tide. The initial transcription process took 3 grueling weeks. She filled her own modern notebooks with the translated data. She created complex cross-references. She built a comprehensive alphabetical index. The raw historical information was now fully accessible. It was structurally ready for the modern scientific community. She packed the newly transcribed notes into a heavy waterproof bag. She placed the original, fragile volumes back into the forged iron trunks. She wrapped the trunks in thick layers of industrial plastic. The physical preservation was complete. The intellectual extraction was successful. The doomed forest house had served its true, hidden purpose. It was never just a place to hide from the world. It was a designated vault, waiting patiently for the right custodian. The next logical step required breaking her absolute isolation. This data belonged to the world. She had to return to the very society that had discarded her. But she would not return empty-handed. She was no longer a broken victim of circumstance. She was the sole guardian of a lost scientific frontier. The rusted hinges of the wooden box gave way with a dry snap. Inside lay not gold, but something far more valuable to a starving academic world. Hundreds of pressed botanical specimens rested between sheets of wax paper. Faded ink labels detailed coordinates from over a century ago. The woman carefully lifted the top layer. She recognized the dried petals of a mountain orchid. Official records declared this specific species extinct 80 years prior. She needed a camera. Her old smartphone barely held a charge. She managed to capture 3 clear images of the orchid, the handwritten notes, and the wax seal of a forgotten botanical society. She walked 2 miles to catch a stable cellular signal. The email went to the general inbox of the National University Biology Department. Silence lasted for 3 days. Then, an unmarked off-road vehicle navigated the broken dirt path to her property. 2 figures stepped out. One was an elderly man in a tweed jacket. The other was a younger assistant carrying metal equipment cases. They looked at the patched roof of the ruin. They looked at the woman in her work-stained clothes. Skepticism radiated from their posture. She did not offer tea. She led them straight to the reinforced cellar. The temperature dropped. The assistant activated a portable halogen lamp. The beam hit the open box on the stone table. The elderly professor stopped breathing for a second. He pulled a jeweler's loupe from his pocket. He leaned over the preserved orchid. He examined the cellular structure of the dried leaves. He checked the signature on the faded parchment. He turned to the woman. His hands trembled slightly. The academic arrogance was gone. The cellar held 12 more boxes. Each contained meticulous records of the pre-industrial ecosystem of the region. There were vials of dormant seeds sealed in glass. There were soil composition charts. The original owner of the estate had not been a mere aristocrat. He had been a pioneer of ecological preservation. He had hidden his life work from the destruction of past conflicts. News spread through the academic backchannels within 48 hours. The isolated ruin became the epicenter of a scientific earthquake. The university dispatched a permanent team. They brought mobile laboratories. They installed climate control sensors in the vault. The woman watched the invasion of her sanctuary. She felt a brief spike of territorial panic. This was her fortress. She had rebuilt it with her bare hands. But the scientists did not treat her as a squatter. The professor insisted she remain present during every cataloging session. She knew the structural quirks of the cellar. She knew the moisture patterns of the stone walls. Her survival knowledge translated directly into preservation expertise. The legal status of the property shifted rapidly. The regional government could not ignore the discovery. The university drafted an emergency petition. They demanded immediate federal protection for the site. Bureaucratic hurdles vanished. A location previously zoned for demolition received a new designation. It became a protected historical and scientific reserve. State funding followed the new title. The first grant arrived within 2 months. It was not a small sum. The money was earmarked for structural stabilization and archival research. The woman signed the contract as the official site custodian and lead field assistant. She received a university identification card. The plastic rectangle felt heavier than the stones she had hauled to fix the walls. It was proof of existence. It was an anchor to the social world she had abandoned. Construction crews arrived with heavy machinery. They did not come to tear the building down. They came to reinforce the foundation. They poured new concrete supports. They installed a commercial-grade solar power array. The makeshift roof was replaced with weather-resistant materials. The woman directed the foreman. She pointed out the weak, load-bearing beams. She ensured the heavy equipment did not disturb the root systems of the surrounding ancient trees. The workers listened to her. They respected her intimate knowledge of the structure. Inside the newly illuminated vault, The scientific work intensified. The dormant seeds were transferred to a secure germination chamber. The assistant successfully sprouted a regional wheat variant unseen for 9 decades. This single event attracted international attention. Agricultural conglomerates sent inquiries. The university shielded the project under state heritage laws. The woman learned the Latin names of the specimens. She mastered the protocol for handling fragile parchment. The professor treated her as an equal. He recognized the fierce dedication in her eyes. She protected the archive with the same intensity she had used to protect herself from the winter cold. A major symposium was scheduled in the capital. The university planned to present the findings of the archive to the global scientific community. The professor insisted the woman accompany the team. She bought a simple dark suit. It was her first new clothing purchase in 3 years. She stood in front of the cracked mirror in her upgraded living quarters. The reflection showed a different person. The hunted look was gone. Her posture was straight. Her hands were calloused, but her eyes were sharp and focused. The symposium hall held 500 people. Journalists set up cameras in the aisles. Government officials occupied the front rows. The professor delivered the opening remarks. He detailed the historical context of the forgotten botanist. Then, he stepped aside. He invited the woman to the podium. She approached the microphone. The silence in the room was absolute. She did not speak of her personal tragedy. She did not mention the betrayal that led her to the ruins. She spoke only of the stones. She described the microclimate of the cellar. She explained how the specific depth and ventilation shafts created a perfect natural humidor. She detailed the exact moment she broke the seal on the first box. Her voice was steady. The short, precise sentences carried the weight of undeniable truth. She commanded the room. The presentation concluded with a standing ovation. Representatives from global heritage foundations approached her. They offered international grants. They proposed collaborative research programs. She accepted their business cards with polite professionalism. She was no longer an outcast. She was no longer the marginalized figure living in a collapsing shell. She was the guardian of a national treasure. The society that had previously discarded her now depended on her. The university established a permanent research station on her land. They built a separate modern cabin for the visiting scientists. The original stone house remained her private residence. It was fully restored, warm, and secure. She sat on her reinforced porch one evening. The solar lights illuminated the pathway to the research cabin. She held a cup of hot coffee. The bitter taste grounded her. She looked at the polished brass plaque newly affixed to her front door. It bore the seal of the National Heritage Registry. Her isolation had transformed into a fortress of purpose. The public humiliation of her past was buried under the weight of historical significance. She had built her survival on the forgotten remnants of the past. Now, that past was securing her future. The local media began publishing articles about the site. They featured photographs of the restored estate. They highlighted the role of the woman in the discovery. Her face appeared on news portals. Her name, previously whispered in pity or mockery, was now spoken with respect. This public visibility was a double-edged sword. The shield of obscurity was gone. The bright light of success cast long shadows. The news reached the city. It reached the screens of those who had orchestrated her downfall. The people who had stripped her of her previous life now saw her rising from the ashes they had created. She knew the silence from her past would not last. The sudden influx of state money and public prestige was a beacon. It would attract the figures she had fled. But she did not feel fear. She set her coffee cup on the wooden table. She touched the cold metal of the university keycard in her pocket. She had defended this ground against storms, starvation, and despair. She had the backing of the state and the scientific community. The ruins were rebuilt. Her mind was fortified. The architecture of her survival was complete. The final test was approaching. The heavy tires of a luxury sedan crushed the white gravel of the newly restored driveway. Dust plumed into the crisp morning air. The vehicle stopped precisely at the boundary, where the modern road met the 16th century cobblestones. 3 people stepped out. 12 months ago, these same individuals had systematically stripped the woman of her home, her savings, and her dignity. Now, they stood before the wrought iron gates of a recognized national heritage site. They had come to reclaim the sister and daughter they had discarded. The woman watched them from the arched window of the curator's office. Her pulse remained steady. A year prior, this site would have triggered a panic attack. Today, she felt only the cool detachment of an anthropologist observing a predictable behavioral pattern. They approached the main entrance. The brother adjusted his expensive tie. The mother practiced a look of deep, maternal concern. They did not look at the meticulously restored masonry. They did not notice the bronze plaque from the Ministry of Culture. Their eyes scanned the property, calculating square footage, estimating market value, and assessing the potential for commercial exploitation. She walked down the stone spiral staircase to meet them. She wore practical canvas work clothes and heavy boots. Her hands bore the permanent calluses of manual labor and archaeological excavation. She opened the heavy oak door before they could knock. The initial exchange lacked any genuine warmth. The brother stepped forward, attempting a familiar embrace. She took a deliberate half-step back. The physical boundary was established immediately. She invited them into the reception hall. The room was a testament to her survival. Glass display cases held the artifacts she had pulled from the mud. The walls displayed framed architectural blueprints and official government grants. The relatives sat on a modern leather sofa, looking entirely out of place among the centuries-old artifacts. The mother spoke first. She deployed a carefully rehearsed narrative of misunderstandings and tragic circumstances. She claimed the family had always intended to support her. She blamed the harsh economic climate for their past actions. The brother quickly transitioned to business. He praised her hard work. He suggested that managing such a large estate was too much for one person. He offered the services of his investment firm to help commercialize the historical site. The woman listened in absolute silence. She did not interrupt. She did not defend herself. She let them exhaust their prepared scripts. Every word they spoke confirmed her hypothesis. They were not seeking a family reunion. They were executing a hostile takeover. The national press coverage of her discoveries had alerted them to a new, untapped asset. When the room finally fell silent, she stood up. She walked to a heavy wooden desk and opened a drawer. She did not raise her voice. She did not express anger. Anger required an emotional investment she was no longer willing to make. She placed a single manila folder on the low table between them. The brother opened it. His eyes darted across the legal text. The document was a finalized deed of trust. 3 weeks prior, she had legally transferred the entire estate, the land, and all discovered artifacts to an irrevocable nonprofit foundation. She was listed merely as the salaried director and head curator. The property could never be sold. It could never be leveraged for private loans. It belonged to the state and to history. The transformation in the room was instantaneous. The mother's mask of affection dissolved into a hard, rigid glare. The brother's face flushed red. The illusion of family loyalty shattered against the cold reality of a legally binding document. They realized there was no money to extract. There was no real estate to flip. The brother threw the folder back onto the table. He accused her of selfishness. He called her vindictive. He demanded to know how she could betray her own blood. She looked directly into his eyes. She explained that blood was merely a biological coincidence. True kinship required mutual protection. They had left her to freeze in a ruined shell of a building. They had ignored her calls when she was starving. She had survived not because of her family, but in spite of them. She pointed toward the door. The gesture was absolute. They left quickly. There were no goodbyes. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind them. The luxury sedan reversed aggressively, throwing white gravel onto the manicured lawn. The vehicle disappeared down the winding valley road. The woman stood alone in the quiet hall. She waited for the grief to arrive. She expected a wave of sorrow for the final death of her family unit. The sorrow never came. Instead, a profound, expansive lightness filled her chest. The phantom limb of her past had finally been amputated. She was entirely free. She walked out into the central courtyard. The midday sun warmed the ancient stones. A team of university students was already at work in the eastern trench. They were carefully brushing dirt from a newly discovered mosaic. The lead archaeologist, a man who had spent the last 6 months teaching her the science of preservation, waved to her from the scaffolding. These people were her true capital. They shared her values. They respected the fragile nature of history. They understood the necessity of hard, unglamorous work. She had built a new family from the ground up, selecting its members based on integrity and shared purpose. Forgiveness, she realized, did not require reconciliation. She forgave her relatives for their weakness. She accepted their greed as a fundamental flaw in their character. Holding on to resentment would only poison the sanctuary she had built. She released them from her mind completely. They were simply a closed chapter in a very long book. She picked up her clipboard and walked toward the excavation site. There was a structural assessment scheduled for the afternoon. A new exhibition needed to be planned for the upcoming spring season. The past was securely locked in the display cases. Her future was waiting in the earth, ready to be uncovered. Margaret's incredible journey from a discarded mother to the guardian of a national heritage site teaches us a profound truth about human resilience. She was betrayed by the daughter who should have protected her. She was mocked by wealthy investors for buying a collapsed stone vault everyone called a liability. She survived a brutal, freezing winter that would have broken most people. But Margaret refused to accept society's judgment of her value. She refused to believe that being older meant being helpless. Instead, she took a corpse of a building and transformed it into a historical fortress. The $500 pile of rocks that everyone laughed at became a priceless scientific reserve. The woman her family called an inconvenience became an irreplaceable force. She proved that your worth is not determined by who abandons you. It is determined by what you build after they leave. Sometimes, the most devastating rejection is the exact catalyst you need for your greatest liberation. And as Margaret learned, true family isn't always bound by blood. It's built on respect, integrity, and shared purpose. If Margaret's triumph over betrayal moved you today, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. And we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been underestimated or betrayed by those closest to you? How did you rebuild your own fortress? Your story could be the exact inspiration someone else needs right now. Thank you for watching. Remember, you are never too old to start over, and you are never worthless just because someone failed to see your value. We will see you in the next story.